The suitcase slipped from Marcus's hand and hit the hardwood floor with a crack that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet house. He hadn't meant to come home early. The construction project in Phoenix had wrapped up days ahead of schedule, and instead of calling ahead, instead of giving anyone time to prepare, he had driven 14 hours straight to surprise his 8-year-old son. He had imagined Joshua's face lighting up, imagined the tight hug around his neck, imagined for a fleeting moment that he might still be the kind of father who knew how to show up at the right time. But none of those thoughts survived the sight in his bedroom doorway. A stranger lay curled beneath his navy blue comforter. A woman. Shoes kicked off on the rug, dark hair spilling across his pillow, the bedside lamp still on, breathing slow and deep, like she belonged there. His first emotion wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was that cold, hollow feeling that starts in the stomach and crawls up into your chest, the feeling that tells you something in your life has shifted in a way you cannot undo. If this were your house, if this were your bed, what would you think in that moment? Would your heart pound with betrayal, or would you feel the same sharp twist of confusion and fear that gripped him? Marcus stood frozen, staring at the maid he had hired only 3 months ago. Her name was Tessa. She was 26, soft-spoken, with tired eyes and a gentle way of moving through the house like she didn't want to disturb anything. A friend from church had recommended her after Marcus admitted he was drowning, working 12-hour days, trying to cook, clean, help with homework, and hold together a home that had already cracked when his wife, Rachel, died in a car accident 2 years earlier on a rainy stretch of highway outside Columbus, Ohio. Since Rachel's death, Marcus had been surviving, not living. The house in suburban Columbus felt too big and too quiet. Every room held memories that pressed against him like invisible hands. Joshua still asked at night whether Mom could see them from heaven, and Marcus always answered yes, though he sometimes doubted everything when he lay awake staring at the ceiling. Tessa had come into their lives quietly. She cleaned, cooked simple meals, and sometimes stayed late if Marcus's job ran long. He told himself he hired her for practicality, but the truth was he needed help more than he was willing to admit. Now she was in his bed. His jaw tightened. His mind raced with explanations that all felt ugly. Had she brought someone here? Had she taken advantage of his absence? Had he been blind? He stepped forward, the floor creaking under his boots. Tessa stirred, her eyes fluttering open slowly, confusion clouding them before recognition struck. She sat up abruptly, clutching the blanket to her chest as if she had done something shameful. Marcus expected panic, excuses, lies. Instead, what he saw was fear. Not the fear of getting caught doing something wrong, but the fear of someone who had already been living on the edge. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her gaze flicked past him toward the hallway, toward Joshua's room. That's when Marcus noticed something else. On his nightstand, next to Rachel's framed photograph, lay a folded piece of paper, and on the floor near the dresser sat a small pink backpack that did not belong to Joshua. Marcus's heart began to pound harder. He walked past Tessa without a word and picked up the paper. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven, but careful. It was Joshua's. He had written about a nightmare, about how he woke up crying and couldn't breathe because he dreamed he was losing another person he loved. He wrote that Tessa heard him and came to his room. He wrote that he begged her not to leave him alone because the house felt too big and too empty at night. He wrote that she didn't want to get in trouble but stayed anyway. He wrote that she lay down beside him until he fell asleep, and then she must have gotten tired and fallen asleep in Dad's room by accident when she went to grab a blanket. At the bottom, in big, crooked letters, Joshua had written, "Please don't fire her. She's the only one who doesn't look sad all the time." The words hit Marcus harder than any accusation could have. He turned slowly. Tessa was standing now, barefoot on the rug, her face pale. In the doorway behind her stood Joshua, small and trembling, eyes wide and shiny with unshed tears. It was in that moment that Marcus realized the deepest betrayal in that room wasn't from her. It was from his own grief. He had been so consumed by his pain, by his exhaustion, by his quiet anger at God and fate and everything else, that he hadn't seen how much of his sorrow had spilled onto his son. He had thought he was holding it together. But children notice what we think we hide. They feel the heaviness in the air. Tessa finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she was sorry. She said she never meant to cross any lines. She explained that Joshua had been shaking so badly from his nightmare that she couldn't walk away. She told Marcus that she understood if he wanted her gone, but she just didn't want the boy to feel alone. There was something in her voice that carried more than just concern for a job. Marcus noticed the pink backpack again. He asked about it. Her composure cracked then. She hesitated, and in that hesitation lived 1,000 unspoken struggles. She admitted that she had been sleeping in her car the past week. The family she rented a room from had asked her to leave after she fell behind on payments when her mother's medical bills swallowed her savings. She hadn't wanted to say anything. She had been looking for a second job. She had planned to figure it out quietly. That night, after calming Joshua, she had felt so dizzy from exhaustion that when she sat on the edge of Marcus's bed to think, she must have drifted off. Marcus felt the room spin slightly. In one instant, the story he had built in his head dissolved into something far more complicated and far more painful. Here was a young woman who had nothing, who owed him nothing beyond basic employment, choosing to comfort his son when he couldn't, choosing kindness over caution, choosing compassion over self-preservation. Joshua stepped forward, wrapping his arms around Marcus's waist. His voice trembled as he asked his father not to be mad. That was the moment something inside Marcus broke. He knelt and held his son tightly, feeling the small ribs beneath his hands, the fragility of a life that depended entirely on him. He realized that strength wasn't about controlling every situation or guarding every boundary with suspicion. Sometimes it was about seeing the humanity in front of you, even when it challenged your pride. The days that followed were awkward at first. Marcus insisted Tessa move into the guest room temporarily while she found stable housing. She resisted, worried about appearances, worried about gossip in their small church community. But he made it clear it wasn't charity, it was decency. Living under the same roof changed everything. Marcus began noticing the small details of Tessa's life. The way she studied nursing textbooks late at night after finishing chores. The way she sent half her paycheck to her mother in Kentucky. The way she hummed old hymns while washing dishes, hymns Rachel used to sing. The house began to feel different. Joshua laughed more. The heavy silence that once dominated dinner slowly lifted. Marcus still had bad nights, still sat alone sometimes staring at Rachel's photograph, but he found himself talking about her instead of avoiding her memory. Tessa would listen quietly, never trying to replace anyone, never crossing lines, just offering presence. Weeks turned into months. Marcus learned that Tessa had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home, never really belonging anywhere. She had promised herself she would build a life where no child felt unwanted the way she once had. One evening, after a long shift at the construction site, Marcus came home to find Joshua and Tessa baking cookies. Flour dusted their clothes. Laughter filled the kitchen. It was a simple scene, ordinary and beautiful. And for the first time since Rachel's death, Marcus didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. He felt something else. Hope. Not the dramatic movie-style kind, but the quiet, fragile kind that creeps in slowly and asks permission to stay. Yet life was not finished testing them. When Tessa's mother's condition worsened, she prepared to move back to Kentucky permanently. She thanked Marcus for everything, her eyes glossy but resolute. She said she couldn't abandon the only family she had left. Joshua overheard the conversation. That night he cried harder than he had in months. Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with himself. He had spent 2 years avoiding emotional risk, convincing himself that protecting his heart was the same as protecting his son. But was it? If this were your chance at rebuilding something beautiful, would you let fear decide? The next morning, Marcus made a decision that shocked even him. He offered Tessa not just financial support for her mother's treatment, but a partnership. He proposed starting a small in-home care service together, combining her nursing ambitions with his savings and business experience. He suggested relocating temporarily to Kentucky if necessary, expanding later. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't impulsive, it was practical and brave and rooted in something deeper than convenience. Tessa cried when he told her, not because of money, but because someone was finally choosing her the way she had chosen others her entire life. Over the next year, they built something from scratch. It wasn't easy. There were arguments about finances, sleepless nights, clients who didn't pay on time, but there was also purpose. There was shared effort. There was healing. Marcus learned that love doesn't always arrive in dramatic declarations. Sometimes it grows quietly in shared responsibilities and mutual respect. He never tried to erase Rachel's memory. Instead, he honored it by living fully again. One spring afternoon, nearly 2 years after the night he found Tessa in his bed, Marcus stood in the backyard of their modest Kentucky home, watching Joshua teach Tessa's mother how to toss a baseball gently. The woman's laughter rang across the yard despite her frailty. Marcus felt tears in his eyes. If he had reacted with anger that night, if he had chosen suspicion over curiosity, if he had fired her without reading that note, his life would have followed a completely different path. Sometimes the most shocking discovery isn't betrayal, it's grace. And just before this story ends, I want to ask you something deeply personal. What would you have done in his place? Would you have listened or walked away? Marcus eventually married Tessa in a small church ceremony surrounded by a handful of close friends. It wasn't about replacing the past. It was about embracing a future they had built together from broken pieces. Joshua grew into a confident teenager who no longer feared the dark. He once told Marcus that the night he wrote that note was the scariest of his life, not because of the nightmare, but because he was afraid his father's anger would push away the one person who made the house feel warm again. Marcus never forgot that. He understood now that being a father meant more than providing. It meant being humble enough to admit when you were wrong, strong enough to forgive, brave enough to begin again. And if this story moved you even a little, if it made you reflect on your own choices, your own second chances, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe, but only if it truly touched your heart.